What's happening, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here, and on Mondays I usually talk about X-Men related things, and most of the time I will talk about individual storylines from an ongoing run of an X-Men series. But over the last month I have been talking about standalone miniseries set in the franchise of the X-Men. And if you'll recall last week when I talked about Kitty Pryde, Shadow, and Flame, I said that I wish the X-Men world had done a lot more solo minis, focusing on characters who couldn't necessarily sustain an ongoing series, but could sustain a mini-series every now and then. Well, forget that I ever said that, because this week I'm going to be talking about Colossus Bloodline by David Hine and Jorge Lucas. This is garbage. This story is completely awful. If you'll recall, I really enjoyed Kitty Pryde, Shadow, and Flame. That was a story that worked as its own little miniseries. It was a very clever, fun little story. I didn't have anything bad to say about it at all. This story, on the opposite end of things, I don't think I can think of a single good thing to say about it. Number one, the premise is just extremely stupid. The premise is that Colossus, his real name is Peter Rasputin, and this story is trying to tell us that he is a descendant of Grigory Rasputin, who was a counselor to the royal family of Russia back in the early 1900s. And then you've maybe heard of Rasputin. He was the bad guy in the Disney animated film Anastasia, and allegedly it took a whole lot to actually kill him in real life. Like, they poisoned him, they shot him, and eventually they drowned him. Well, all that is mentioned in this story, and this story tries to tell us that Grigory Rasputin was one of the early mutants, and Mr. Sinister found Grigory and told him, hey, you're a really powerful mutant, and all of your kids are going to be really powerful mutants, so you need to go around and impregnate like thousands of women and have a whole bunch of mutant children who can one day become an army of mutants. And so that was Rasputin's plan, and then he is betrayed and eventually killed, and then we are told that somehow, magically, Rasputin was able to place a little bit of his essence in each of his descendants, and then when a descendant had more kids, then his essence was further split up, and then somehow Rasputin's mind is able to take over the mind of Colossus's uncle Vladimir, and then Nathaniel Essex, Mr. Sinister, meets up with Vladimir at some point, and Vladimir is speaking as Grigory Rasputin, and he says, hey, what we need to do, we need to kill all of the Rasputins, and then Grigory Rasputin will be reborn in one of his descendants, and his mind and essence will be whole, and he will no longer be divided. And that's the basic plot of this story. You've got a few cousins of Colossus who die in this story, and then you've got Mikhail Rasputin, who was a pretty big X-Men villain in the 90s, and he's Peter's older brother. He's insane, and he's kind of got a little bit of Grigory in him, and Peter's got a little bit of Grigory in him, and basically the plot is Mr. Sinister is trying to resurrect Grigory Rasputin, I guess so that he can create a new army of mutants who are all sired by Grigory Rasputin. This story is stupid for a number of reasons. Number one, I always just assumed, I've never been to Russia, but I always just assumed that the name Rasputin was a really common name over there, kind of like Smith in America. Like, if you meet two people who are named Smith, there's not a very high likelihood that they're related to each other, because there's like a billion Smiths in America. At one point in this story, Colossus even tells his cousin that Rasputin is not a very uncommon name, and somehow it ends up being that this farm boy from out in the middle of nowhere in Russia is related to the Russian royal advisor from 100 years earlier. That is all kinds of stupid, and that is just one reason why the story is stupid. The other reason is that for some reason, Mr. Sinister wants Grigory Rasputin to be alive again so that he can create an army of mutants. This is in the modern 21st century when mutants are about a dime a dozen. And I think this was even before House of M, so there were many, many mutants in the Marvel Universe, so there was absolutely no reason for Mr. Sinister to want to create more mutants who are all descended from Grigory Rasputin. No reason at all. I don't understand why Mr. Sinister is trying to bring back Grigory, other than, hey, he's an old buddy of his from the early 1900s, and he wants to bring him back. It's also really stupid that for some reason Mr. Sinister's powers are going away. We're told that at the end of this miniseries. That's never explained. It's also never explained how his powers came back, because later on, circa Messiah Complex, Mr. Sinister is back once again, and we don't know why his powers are back. I think pretty much as soon as this miniseries was over, everybody in the world just pretended like it didn't happen, which, good. It's really not okay that somebody out there thought that it would be a fun story to have Colossus be a descendant of Grigory Rasputin. So if everyone who ever works at Marvel Comics just pretends like this story doesn't exist, that would be fine with me. But I would at least like to see some acknowledgement of why Mr. Sinister doesn't have his superpowers in this story. Why are his powers going away? That's never explained to us. Also, for for some reason, this story chooses to ignore the fact that Colossus has a son in the Savage Land, who was conceived before the Dark Phoenix saga. So this would have been like 78 or 79, something like that. Colossus had intercourse with a lady who lived in the Savage Land, and then about 10 years later in comics, about 10 years after that story, Colossus went back to the Savage Land, and he met the woman, and she had a kid whose name was Peter. And it was never fully explained to Colossus that he was actually a father. It was pretty much a given to the audience, but I don't think that Colossus actually knew that. But then in this story, Colossus's uncle Vladimir, he seems to have this psychic connection with all of the remaining Rasputins. He knows where Mikhail is, and Mikhail is out traveling the multiverse in some weird, crazy Steve Ditko universe, and Uncle Vladimir knows where Mikhail is, but for some reason he doesn't tell Mr. Sinister that there's another Rasputin kid in the Savage Land. And of course, David Hine probably doesn't even know that. He may not have even read that story, and he probably didn't even think that that would be important to read that story. I don't know. But this story is just really bad. Like I said, I cannot find anything good about it. Basically, at the end of the story, Mikhail goes back off into some alternate reality where, I guess, the spirit of Grigory Rasputin cannot reach him anymore. So now all of Rasputin's essence is inside Colossus. It's a very downer story, and we're told, okay, now Mr. Sinister will not kill Colossus, because if he does, then Grigory Rasputin is going to be dispersed and will no longer be able to resurrect himself, I guess. Of course, that is assuming that Colossus does not have a kid in the Savage Land, which he does. So if Colossus does die, then all of Rasputin's ghost essence, I guess, would go to Peter in the Savage Land. But basically, the story ends with all of Rasputin's energy or essence or whatever trapped inside Colossus, and Colossus goes to his room, and he's sad, and he's hiding, and he's crying or whatever. This story is awful, guys. This is garbage. This is the kind of terrible, awful X-Men story that I am glad, hopefully, knock on wood, hopefully we're never going to be seeing this kind of X-Men story again, where we have 4,000 X-Men books coming out a month, and so it's okay for something like this to slip by the radar and happen and exist. Hopefully now that we live in a world where we only have about 5 X-Men books a month, hopefully we're not going to be getting this kind of really subpar, awful story coming out because we just have 1,000 X-Men books coming out a month, and we need something to put out there so that we can have more X-Men books. Hopefully we're not going to be having stuff like this anymore. Of course, I say that. Of course, we're still going to be getting bad stories every now and then, but hopefully we won't get something that exists only to be just more quantity and less quality, if you know what I'm saying. So overall, Colossus Bloodline. Garbage, garbage, garbage. Hated this story. I do not recommend that you read it. Even if you're a fan of Colossus, I don't really think that you'll enjoy this story. It's just really not very good at all. So those are my thoughts on that X-Men miniseries, and next week I will be talking about another X-Men miniseries, and then after that, in the month of March, I think I'm going to be getting back to talking about storylines in a specific X-Men run. So I'll be getting to that in March. In the meantime, I hope that you guys have a great rest of the day, and I will see you later. Have a good one.